And then we finally came to a town which was called Auschwitz. And we started, and we saw 2 American tanks. One was, there were 2 soldiers on there who were quite visibly drunk, which made quite an impression on me. I said, oh, here are my liberators, but they are drunk. But we felt we were now on safe territory, which we were not, because that area was infested with SS. And they told us that. And they were looking for them. And there was shooting in that area. So we decided we didn't want to stay there. And there was a big assembly camp too, and I said, I don't go into any more camps. So we continued, and some of the French soldiers went with us. And finally we arrived at another town that was called Wurzen, small town, on a small river, which was a little river coming from the Elbe. It was called the Moldau. Not Moldau, Mulde. Moldau is in Czechoslovakia, the Mulde. And we were staying in a schoolhouse, getting some sort of old uniforms and clothing and so forth and so on. And there were a few American soldiers there. And they said, you can sleep here during the night. The bridge has been bombed, but you can stay here and we will see what to do with you. During the night, one of the American soldiers came in, knocked on our door and said, you have to get out of here by the morning, the Russians are coming. That was already the set division between the American and Russian zones. And so he told us where to go to the bridge, tell the officers who we were and that we should cross the bridge to the other side where the Americans would be. It wasn't so easy, because the American officers on that bridge refused to let us go. They had never heard about the camps. They had no idea who we were. When they saw our number, they were absolutely, they didn't know what to make of us. We were the first ones over that particular area. And they had no orders. And they were leery of Germans, which I could understand. But since I could speak English and well enough to make myself quite understood and to tell them all sorts of things, I argued with them for 3 days. I gave them addresses in the United States. I told them all sorts of things which should reassure them that we were not what they thought maybe we would be, even with our numbers. Until the 3rd day, when one of them finally said, okay, you can go. And one of them took us. We held, because this bridge was completely destroyed, and on one side of the bridge the Russian soldiers were already standing and were grinning at us, and the Americans were leading us over the bridge. And the ironic thing is that the last thing these Americans said to us is, when you come to the Americans on the other side, don't tell them where you come from. I said, what do you mean where I come from? He said, don't tell them that we let you go over the bridge because it's against orders. To us this was all, I mean, we just laughed. We couldn't understand it. Today, okay, orders are orders, but here we were. So then we met another American, and he asked us where we were going, and we said, well, we want to go back to Belgium. To Belgium? You're in Saxony. I said, yes, and then we told him our story. And he brought us into a very nice German villa where the Americans were billeted. And there, of course, it was an uproar when we got there, when they found out who we were, and we started to talk to them all night through. There were 2 or 3, I'm not sure, American Jewish soldiers there. And they started to feed us, and they gave us their bedrooms. We said, no, we don't want to do it, and they gave us their bedrooms. And they behaved really very, very well. And a few days later, they brought us to Leipzig, and there finally we made arrangements. That camp held mostly prisoners of war from France, from Belgium. And I had to explain to the Belgian officers that I was from Belgium, which I wasn't.
Right.
But I could still tell him a lot of things. I told him that I was registered there and there, that my friend who was with me was imprisoned in Brussels as a communist, not as a Jew, but she was a Jew and a communist, that there were all sorts of papers on her. Well, it took a little bit of doing for them to send us home on a prisoner of war train, because I said, I will not go into a refugee camp. I refuse. And they took us, and on May the 9th, a big transport trains went with French prisoners and, of war and Belgian prisoners of war, and a few civilians, we among them, we went on that train ride through destroyed Germany, which was one of the most incredible journeys I have made and will ever make. It was a mixture between elation and absolute depression when we thought about what we left behind, all those who didn't come back, the horrors, but somehow we were gratified to see this Germany destroyed. And we found that we could sing. And I had this distinct feeling that this was to be one of the saddest but freest moments of my life, because I didn't know what was in front of me.
Right.
I knew that my father was alive, but for the rest I didn't know what was going to happen to me. So the trip took us from May the 9th to May the 15th when we arrived in Brussels. And in Brussels, I contacted some Jewish people who I had hoped would have survived. They were people of means who had hidden in France and so forth and so on, and they took me in.
At what point were you able to contact your father?
Okay. I had already sent an Army Red Cross letter through on the train from Germany into Belgium. There was an American train engineer. And I told him my story, and he gave me a Red Cross letter. And through him, I sent that letter to an address here in the United States, in New York City, because my father's former boss was here. And I was sure that my father was here. So that letter got there, I think, in 4 weeks or something like that. And my father was not here. He was in Cuba. See, he never got into the United States at the beginning, which we didn't know. He had to go through Cuba. And in 1945, of course, he was still there. He couldn't have come to the United States because he needed a quota. So I found out 2 weeks later, maybe, that I got a telegram from him, from Cuba.
When did you first get to see him?
Oh, not until 1946, when I joined him in Cuba.
Mm-hmm. Could you describe the moment you first saw him?
Yeah, that was, I came by boat from Sweden. And so I approached the harbor, the Havana harbor, on a boat. And the first impression, I didn't see him. I saw the city of Havana. When you see the city of Havana from a boat, it is so colorful that somebody from Europe and from war-torn Europe who sees this, I thought I was in a movie. I didn't know where I was. And my father had arranged with one of the medical people who were to board the ship to be sure that, you know, we were vaccinated and all that kind of thing. So he had arranged to come on one of the little boats. So I saw him from the boat, in the little boat, approaching with his big hat on.
Did you recognize him right away?
Yeah, sure I did. And then, you know, we saw each other on the boat. He came onto the boat. And we didn't talk about anything. There was nothing to be said. And he didn't know anything. I mean, people didn't know anything. They knew, but they didn't know the details, and I didn't tell him the details until much later. Because he thought, he knew that my mother was dead, because I had sent a card which we were forced to write by the Germans in Auschwitz. We were forced to write cards twice to show the world that we were alive. And I had sent that to Portugal, to neutral Portugal, and they had sent it to my father. They let him know. I didn't say mother is dead in the card. It was in code, which everybody understood. So he knew my mother was dead, but he didn't know how.
Right. When did you finally get to the United States?
I came to the United States in 1951 because I stayed in Cuba. I worked there for 5 years. I learned Spanish. I worked for all sorts of people. At the end, at 2 years, I worked for the Belgian embassy there. And then all the refugees left Cuba. There's hardly anyone left. And my father stayed, but I decided to come to the United States, and I needed medical treatment, which was better here than in Cuba. So that's how I came in 1951. And I lived here alone. And I got a job right away. It was no problem at that time. And I always mention that to my children, that at that time, you wanted to work, you could work. And so I spent nearly 10 years alone here in New York. And I worked and made friends. And then in 1960, I met my husband at a big Auschwitz reunion. It was one of the first reunions that was done here in the Bronx.
And his name is?
Harry Stiefel.
And when were you married?
We were married in 1961.
And
what am I talking about? Sorry about that. And
okay.
we were married that same year, 1960. Yes.
And do you have any children?
Yeah, I have a son. We have a son. And he was born in 1961.
And his name is?
Louis.
I guess just as a final question, is there any one thing that you would like to tell people who are watching this tape in the future about your life and your experiences?
Well, the main thing to tell people is that what I'm telling here is just a tiny story of some of those of us who came back, but the absolute horrors cannot be told. They cannot be imagined by anybody who wasn't there, and I do not expect anybody to understand it. And the main point of these experiences and what happened then in Germany is for everyone to be watchful, to bear in mind that if you don't speak up, if you let it just glide by, if not the same thing, but similar things can happen. And this is the warning. And at the same time, I want to say that I want to pay tribute to the human spirit, and above all, to those who didn't come back.